Okay, so today we're going to walk you through some fundamentals of gross domestic product. That's what GDP stands for. This is going to be the first lesson of Unit 5. We're not going to touch on every single thing that's in your textbook. This is just basically the things that you need to know in order to pass an exam that you'll be faced with in your final exam. Some things that you might not be familiar with, depending on your class, we have essential questions that we normally have to start off a lesson. For this one, the one that you should be focused on is how do economists measure the economy. There should be more than a simplistic answer when trying to respond to it. The simple answer would be they use gross domestic product. But when you answer this, you should be displaying all the knowledge that you gain from this particular lesson. So it should be quite thorough. Now, as we go through this entire lesson, this question should be what's in your mind. That brings us to our learning targets, which those are what are used to basically guide you in trying to answer the essential question. So our first one is determine what gross domestic product is and what economists use it for. Differentiate between real and nominal gross domestic product. Identify the flaws of gross domestic product and the types of economic activities that it does not measure. So we'll be doing all three of those things today, trying to get you to answer the essential question. So our first learning target, determine what gross domestic product is and what economists use it for. We're going to go ahead and tackle that right now. So what it is, so as I mentioned earlier, GDP stands for gross domestic product. Now what gross domestic product is, it's the total value of goods and services produced within a nation's border in a year. The higher the value of goods and services, the better, because the stronger, the higher number your GDP is, the stronger and better your economy is. When we talk about whether the economy is doing well or whether it's doing poorly, the thing that they're using to measure that is gross domestic product. The other thing that goes along with that is the higher the GDP in a country, the higher quality of life I should expect to see as well. Like, for instance, if I look at some of the poorer countries around the world that have short life expectancy, lower literacy rates, high instances of infant mortality, those countries typically all have low GDP output per year. And I would expect to see poor living conditions just from what I can see in their GDP stats. So what's included in GDP? In order to be considered part of gross domestic product, a good or service must meet the following criteria. It has to be a final rather than an intermediate. So we don't count all the things to make the product, we just count the actual product. The good or service has to be produced during the time being counted. When it's sold is irrelevant. So if I make a car today and don't sell it until 2 years from now, it doesn't matter. Gross domestic product is just for the year it was made in. So that car counts for 2017, not for 2 years from now when it's sold. The good or service must be produced within the nation's borders. So if I have a car that comes in from Mexico and is sold in the United States, it doesn't matter as far as counting it for gross domestic product for the United States. That would be going towards the GDP of Mexico. There's a formula that's in your textbook that's used to calculate gross domestic product, and that's C plus I plus G plus X. Now what all those mean are C is for consumption by households, I is for investment, that's what businesses spend money on, G is for government spending, and X is for net exports. And how you do that is you total the amount of value of the things you export versus what you import. It is possible to have a negative net export though. Just a little quick thing here. What country in the world do you believe has the largest gross domestic product? I hear all sorts of answers every year. I've heard Canada, I've heard Russia, I've heard China, I've heard Japan. Most times students do not have the correct answer. And granted, the stats that I have pulled up for this are about 3 years old, but if your guess was the United States, you are absolutely correct at $15.68 trillion. Here's a list of some other things, other nations that you can get a sense of how strong their economy is. The thing I wanted you to pay attention here too, just to put in perspective how big of an economy the United States has. We have right here the gross domestic product of the European Union at $12 trillion. If you're not familiar with what the European Union is, it's a collection of European countries, not all of them. So all of those countries combined have a lower GDP than the United States. So that just shows you how strong our economy is and why we're so important on the world market when it comes to buying and selling goods and services. So the first thing that I want you to try and do to make sure you can try and get these learning targets down is take on this particular activity. The economy is a complicated concept. Normally, economists use GDP or GDP per capita, which we'll cover in a later lesson, to help measure the success of an economy. Unfortunately, most people don't know what gross domestic product is or what makes up gross domestic product. Create an explanation to help inform those who are unaware of what exactly gross domestic product is and why it is such an important tool to use in measuring the health of an economy. You should probably pause at this point and go back and see if you can figure out any of the information related to this particular activity. Hopefully you finished up. So here's our second learning target. We're going to differentiate between real and nominal gross domestic product. There are two types. Typically, this is one topic that students struggle with each year. So you might have to review this a few times. I'll try and break it down as simply as I can. Okay. There are two ways to measure gross domestic product. That's going to be real and nominal. So real gross domestic product takes into account what occurs with inflation. Now, I don't know if you already know what inflation is. So inflation is basically the rising of the price of goods and services over years. So like for example, back when I was your age, 15, 16, 17 years old, I could get a candy bar for 60 cents. Now I'm lucky if I can find one for $1. Now the size of the candy bar didn't change, but everything has gone up too. Wages have gone up too, which you'll cover in a later lesson. That would be from demand pull inflation, cost pull inflation, but again, we'll be talking about those later on. The thing that's really important to take into account is that real gross domestic product is the most accurate when measuring growth, and we'll show an example in just a moment. Nominal gross domestic product is calculated by using the products that are made in the year you are examining and also examining the prices from that same year. So what we're going to use is if you made 100 pencils valued at $1 each in 1998, then you would have contributed $100 to gross domestic product. That should be pretty easy. 100 times $1 is $100. So let's take this and you give a difference between real and nominal. So in year one, I make 10 candy bars and they go for a price of $1. Then the contribution towards GDP is $10. But what happens if in year two I make 10 candy bars, but the price goes up to $1.10? Well, that 10 times $1.10 turns into $11. But I didn't actually make more candy bars, and I wouldn't know that if I just looked at gross domestic product, if I just used nominal, meaning the price of the year that I'm examining. So I'm not actually more productive, so that's why we use real. We use prices from the years that we're trying to compare. If we're just examining 1 year, then we would use nominal. If we're trying to track growth, then we use real because we want to take out inflation. Because inflation makes the prices go up, which can give a deceiving perception of what's actually going on in the economy. As you can see in this particular example, I didn't actually make more candy bars. My company wasn't any more productive than it was the year before. But if we just looked at the dollar amount of goods and services that I provided, you would think that I was. So that's why we're going to go ahead and use real. There's a formula for each of these in your textbook. Nominal, the number produced, times the price in that year, is nominal gross domestic product. And then we have real, which is the number produced times the price in the base year. That's real gross domestic product. These aren't any different than what's in your textbook, so if you need to look at them in your textbook, feel free to, but again, it's not going to be any different. We have some practice we can do, so I'll walk you through how to do it. I'm not going to give you the answers to them. These are something that you can simply do on your own. So for nominal gross domestic product, which I'll be looking at in this column, this row, I would just take 200 times 75 because it's the number produced times the price of that year. So over here, you should know that I have 200 times 100. I have 225 times 100, so that would give me this row. When doing nominal, I have to use the price of the base year, meaning the first year that we're using to compare. And the first year that we're using to compare is 2004. And I even listed it right here in case you couldn't figure it out. So these two answers here should be exactly the same. 200 times 75, because 200 was the amount that we produced, times 75, which is the price of the base year. So you'll see that we'll have a very similar exact answer right here. These are the only two that should be, or this one is the only one that should be different because I would use 225. I was actually more productive and the price went up, so it would be 225 times 75 will give me my real GDP for 2006. So here's what I want you to do for the second activity. I want you to examine how real gross domestic product is different from nominal and which one is better to use when determining economic growth and why. And you should take a moment, maybe pause the video and try and figure out the answers. Go back if you have to. Refer to any notes that you've done for reading. Going to try and take on another learning target, which is identify the flaws of gross domestic product and the types of economic activities it doesn't measure. This typically is the favorite of the classes that I teach to discuss because they think some of the examples are pretty funny, but we'll see. The gross domestic products is not perfect. We have some things called non-market activities, underground economy, and the environment. So non-market activities are things that I could do, that I do myself, but I could have hired someone else to do. And the government can't track the value in that. If you cut your own grass, you could have hired that out. So there was no value being able to be tracked because I could have paid someone $20 for a company to do that. But because I didn't, there's no reportings to the U.S. government. If I watch my own children instead of sending them to daycare, that's another non-market activity. If I cook my own food, that's another example of a non-market activity because I could have went out to a restaurant. Now, underground economy, those are things that people do. They are considered illegal, and they're doing those particular activities to try and avoid paying taxes on them. Of course, things can seem a little bit more illegal than others, so examples of an underground economy, if I were participating in it, would be if I sold drugs, so say I sell crack or weed or whatever else. I'm not going to sit there and report that income to the government if I was in that sort of business because they'd probably have me sitting in a prison. Some other things that you might not be aware of too, like if you got paid for cutting grass, you went around the neighborhood and cut grass, or maybe you shoveled snow, you're receiving income from those people, and that's technically supposed to be reported to the government. You could be doing that at your age right now. There are people who do that in their 20s and 30s. But you're supposed to pay taxes on those. And because the government has no idea that you actually earn that money by providing that service, they can't track that either. So that's underground economy as well. There's also the environment too. Just because you have a high gross domestic product for your output each year doesn't necessarily mean that you have the best environment. You could have a lot of pollution. Maybe you don't have as much pollution as someone else, but the environment is something that we can't actually see just by looking at the value of gross domestic product. Now, with real gross domestic product per capita means per person, and it's just an average. Some people will make more, and some people will make less. Now, whatever I make, which I'm not going to say, it certainly isn't as much as what Bill Gates makes each year. And then on the other end, I don't exactly make as little as someone who makes minimum wage. So you have to factor all of those things in, so it's just an average. Activity 3, using examples of what were not used in the presentation, list 3 examples of underground economy and non-market activities. Take some time and review the information that you've gathered and see if you can come up with 3 of each. Then we've got 4. You just overheard a couple discussing that the United States has the highest gross domestic product per capita in the world, so that must mean that all Americans have a higher quality of life than those in other countries. What's the flaw in that logic? That should have been covered in the last slide, which would have been slide 18. So just take some time to review that. So one of the goals for today, let's see if you can actually answer all 3 of these without using the activities you've completed today, without using any notes, just from memory. How many of these 3 can you actually do? Can you determine what gross domestic product is and what economists use it for? Can you differentiate between real and nominal gross domestic product? And can you identify the flaws of gross domestic product and the types of economic activities that does not measure? And then obviously putting it together, our whole goal was to figure out how do economists measure the economy. If you can do all those, we're going to be just fine moving forward for the next test that you'll take. Obviously, since this is a video, you can review it anytime you want.